You've seen it in the media. Violent video games.
Public officials and other critics have raised concerns about the role of media and culture, particularly violent video games.
Violent depictions of women being beaten, raped, and run over by cars. It's not the movies, it's video games.
Keep it honest now on the notion that gun violence has more to do with video game weapons than real ones.
The media has a penchant to use in-game violence as a scapegoat for the unthinkable actions of players outside the game.
The pervasive claims made by the media are not grounded in scientific research or conclusive evidence, but rather in a reactionary mindset to a developing form of storytelling and player immersion. Join us in this short documentary as we reveal how violence is really used as a vehicle to drive the story of video games towards a more energetic, compelling, and interactive experience, rather than belligerently empowering players of acceptable violence.
Many current studies have indicated that the correlation between violence in video games and acts of criminality is arbitrary, even non-existent.
Psychology professor Christopher Ferguson of Stetson University published a 2013 study finding that during the video game epoch, youth violence has declined rather than risen nationally.
In covering mass shootings, the media tends to capitalize on the cases such as the Sandy Hook tragedy, in which a gaming history fits the violent narrative, while ignoring the absence of gaming as a factor in other shootings, such as the 2007 Virginia Tech massacre.
Ferguson claims that many researchers contribute to a moral panic theory, in which they may find it easier to get both grant funding as well as headline attention by arguing that video games present a pressing social problem, even if the data is not conclusive. Thus, both news and research industries have a vested interest in fueling the reactionary mindset that the public and the policymakers that represent them harbor towards violent games.
Congress should fund research into the effects that violent video games have on young minds.
A new wave of more method-oriented studies, powered by an impetus to standardize criteria for analyzing aggression and violence in the games themselves, reveals that many researchers have found little distinction between violent and non-violent games and their psychological influence on the player.
In a 2011 study comparing violent and non-violent games for competitiveness, difficulty, and pace of action, researcher Paula Daci found that competitive games have the potential to heighten aggressive behavior, regardless of the degree of violence involved. However, in a 2013 study by Ferguson and Jessica Jerebic of the Department of Psychology of Texas A&M concluded that cooperative gaming is associated with less aggressive behavior, whether the games themselves are violent or not.
Through cooperative gameplay, camaraderie may transcend the elements of violence, mediating the competitive nature of the game, as well as any resultant hostility between players. We took this debate to the Dartmouth community by speaking with two video game enthusiasts.
Yeah, I would say violence in video games is just another way to be competitive and play along with your friends. I don't think it really correlates to real life. I'm not a violent person. You know, it's not the violence that's the fun of it. Like I said, it's the competing.
It's not really the violence that makes the game entertaining, but it adds on to it. The violence makes the game a bit more like an action game or like a thriller. FIFA 15 doesn't make me want to be a soccer player, so I don't really see the same correlation happening with violent video games.
Most players, like Cole Abbott, do not derive their enjoyment of violent games from the expression of violence, but rather from the same sense of self-determination and engagement featured in all video games.
In their 2009 study, researchers Andrew Przybski and Richard Ryan traced the motivation behind video games to provide opportunities to satisfy basic psychological needs for competence, autonomy, and achievement. They found that violence plays only a minor role as a medium for these satisfactions.
Communication scholar Jerwin Johns argues in a 2005 report that violent video games provide a safe simulation for players, especially adolescents, to explore feelings including those tied to violence, controversial in real life but acceptable in the game world. Such an exploration is visible in the Halo franchise. Halo revolves around an interstellar war between humanity and a theocratic alliance of aliens known as the Covenant. You play as Master Chief, a faceless genetic supersoldier who is tasked with eliminating the Covenant threat in the fight to save humanity. Although the Master Chief may be perceived as a one-dimensional, first-person conduit of the player, his lack of individuality plays an integral role in his identity as a tool of war. Halo drives a wedge between its soldiers and the civilization that they are sworn to protect, challenging whether the role of the soldier is one removed from the principles of humanity.
Our duty as soldiers is to protect humanity, whatever the cost.
You say that like soldiers and humanity are two different things. I mean, soldiers aren't machines. We're just people.
Violent video games can evoke both emotions inherent of the dominant masculinity, such as aggression, as well as those emotions at odds with that masculinity, such as fear and empathy, allowing adolescent males to construct a sense of identity.
As players, we engage in a negotiated reading with violent games, in which we enjoy these games on our own terms of ideology and moral perception. The aftermath of gameplay may be more about what we bring to the game than anything else. We fulfill the means by which violence dictates the plotline, immersion, and gameplay, but we are nonetheless objectively aware of our role outside of the simulation.
Some may not agree, yet as Justice Antonin Scalia ruled in striking down a 2011 California law banning the sale of violent games to minors,
he said that there was no long history or tradition in this country of prescribing minors access to violent content. And he gave as an example Grimm's fairy tales, which he said were grim indeed. Cinderella's three evil stepsisters had their eyes plucked out by doves. Hansel and Gretel got rid of their captor by baking her in an oven.
And so, just as fairy tales establish their place in visual culture, all video games are the next immersive element to provide a beneficial, harmless form of entertainment.